We are about to travel to a very special part of the world. Before we begin, I'd like to mention two items. First, from time to time during the show, I'll be asking questions. When I do, I'm hoping to get some answers, so please feel free to participate. Secondly, I want to mention one word which I will use a lot in the show and which some of you might not recognize. The word is endemic, and it means that it is only found in this one particular place. So when I say a bird, plant, or animal is endemic to the islands, it just means you won't find that creature anywhere else but here. There may be similar or related species elsewhere, but that particular one is only here.
A long time ago when the earth was green, there was more kinds of animals than you'd ever seen. They'd run around free when the earth was being born, but the loveliest of them all was the unicorn. There was green alligators and long-necked geese, some humpty-backed camels and some chimpanzees, some cats and rats and elephants, but sure as you're born, you're never going to see no unicorn.
Well, we may not see any unicorns this evening, but we certainly will see all kinds of other animals. So let's get started. The oceans of the earth are dotted by countless tiny islands, which most of us could never name. Yet, in one small area of the ocean, about 700 miles off the west coast of South America, lies a group of islands belonging to Ecuador. These islands have a name that is recognized by people from many different cultures all around the world. That name is the Galapagos Islands. If I asked you for the name of the person who has resulted in the islands being so well known, how might you answer? Darwin. There you go, exactly. Almost everyone has heard of Charles Darwin and his trip to the Galapagos Islands in 1835. However, it seems to me that knowing his name isn't enough. I think there's a much more important question we need to ask about these islands. On his visit, Darwin found a diversity of life which puzzled him. He eventually realized that this diversity was caused by a process of evolution by means of natural selection. One species actually physically changed into a different species when it found itself in a different habitat and eating different foods. So the question we should ask is, what was it about these islands that provided Darwin with the clues which led to his historic breakthrough in our understanding of evolution? In other words, why did these particular islands provide a unique laboratory to examine how various birds and reptiles, separated by the barrier of water, became different species than their ancestors, who first arrived here by chance? As we explore, perhaps we will find an answer to this question. Let's begin with the geology of the Galapagos. Within an area of about 36,000 square miles of ocean lies 16 major islands and thousands of islets, with a combined land area of about 3,000 square miles. Take a look at this island. Do you see anything that suggests how it formed?
It's volcanic.
Yep, it looks a lot like a volcano. This is Floriana Island, one of the oldest islands and pretty well covered in trees. By contrast, here is one of the younger islands, which also shows that same volcanic cone shape. Anyone have any ideas what they might have named this island? I wouldn't expect you to get this one. They called it Chinese Hat, because it does look a bit like a classic Chinese farmer's hat. Anyway, how is it that all these volcanoes became spread out over this 36,000 square mile area of the ocean? Let's start at the molten core of the Earth. For reasons we don't fully understand, a plume of hot molten rock bubbles off the core, goes through the mantle, and rises towards the lithosphere, the outer shell of the Earth. Slowly, a hot spot forms beneath the crust. In this case, that crust was the Nazca Plate, and about 5 million years ago, the lava broke through that crust as a volcanic eruption on the ocean's floor. Some of these subsea volcanoes built up until they projected above the surface, forming the very first islands and islets of the Galapagos. Here's where our plume breaks through the crust, creating a hotspot. Hispaniola and Floriana were the first islands formed by this hotspot. But the Nazca Plate isn't stationary. The Earth's plates are constantly moving. So, as the Nazca Plate moved slowly southeast, these islands moved with it, away from the plume. But the volcanic activity at the plume site did not stop. The hot magma continued to flow from the break and formed newer islands to the northwest. The largest of the Galapagos Islands, Isabella, is actually a string of 6 different volcanic cones merged together. This formation of volcanic islands by a hotspot is the same process that formed the Hawaiian Islands. Before we leave this slide, let's notice again that the youngest islands are to the northwest, while the oldest islands are to the southeast. So, because these islands formed at different times and are now in different climates, their color and variation are amazing. We'll spend the next few slides looking around Bartolome, one of the younger islands, towards the northwest. It was formed only 1 to 2 million years ago. Notice how these dramatic rock formations preserve the look of the flowing lava. Frozen in time, this lava appears to have just cooled yesterday. For just a moment, let's journey into space and look down on this same area to get a different perspective. Here is Bartolome Island that we are currently visiting. Notice it's actually a tiny neighbor off of a much larger island, Santiago. Here's a preview of the classic view we will see from the peak of Bartolome looking towards Santiago. We can see both that view and the area that we are looking at as seen from above in the upper right corner. Take just a moment to compare the classic picture with this view from above. The black rectangle shows the area seen in the picture, and the blue arrow shows the direction we are looking. Now, notice there is a large volcano here. Only 150 years ago, that volcano erupted, leaving the large dark lava flow we can see, which covers the whole southeastern corner of the island. Now, let's go back to Bartolome and look at all of this from ground level. Here again is that classic Galapagos view, looking across the bays of Bartolome towards Santiago Island. On the horizon, at the left, is that volcano. If we look more carefully at Santiago, we can see the massive lava flow from that volcano that is only 150 years old, reminding us that the process of island formation continues today. Here's a closer look at that new black lava, which flowed around these much older piles of volcanic rock. For a sense of scale, be sure to notice the boat filled with tourists. You may have noticed Pinnacle Rock on Bartolome in that classic view. It is the remains of a volcanic tuff cone, a plug of compressed ash which was once the center of a volcano. Notice that in this part of the island, some hardy plants are struggling to gain a foothold in the rocky soil, while other parts of the island still look like the volcano just finished erupting. Rabida Island, a little to the southeast and slightly older than Bartolome, was created when the plume was rich with iron. This resulted in the stunning red beaches and cliffs we see here. This close-up shows us the red rock pumice from that ancient volcano. By contrast, on Floriana Island, one of the oldest islands far to the southeast, the beach at Punta Cormorant has a distinct green tinge. Look just how green that appears in the right light. This coloring is the result of a lot of volcanically formed olivine crystals mixed into the beach sand. As one of the oldest islands, Floriana is covered with mature trees. Although they seem small by our standards, these are actually full-grown trees. Once the islands have been created by volcanism, the ocean takes over as a major force in shaping them. It tirelessly pounds and wears away at the volcanic rock, creating myriad shapes and habitats for the sea life in these waters. The ocean not only erodes and shapes these islands, but plays the leading role in determining how life survives here. Three major ocean currents are responsible for the climate and ocean nutrients around these islands. For most of the year, the Cromwell current arrives from the west, bringing lots of nutrients to that area. From May to December, the Humboldt current also brings deep, cold, nutrient-rich water up from the Antarctic. In December, the warmer Panama current from the north becomes dominant, bringing hotter, wetter weather to the islands. The water temperatures rise, reducing the amount of food available for sea life. However, from time to time, an El Niño event, a warming of the Pacific Ocean waters, strengthens the warm Panama current to the point that it blocks the cold waters of both the Humboldt and Cromwell currents. This can result in a devastation of the food chain from the bottom up. Without the nutrients, the fish die off, and the sea lions, boobies, and marine iguanas may starve to death in large numbers. As recently as 1997 and 98, an extended El Niño caused declines of up to 50% in the sea lion and booby populations. One prediction of climate change is for more frequent and more severe El Niño events, which may not bode well for these animals. As we've just seen, the ocean is an important part of life on the Galapagos. Our visit to the Galapagos included daily snorkeling trips, which allowed us to glimpse just a small part of the variety of life beneath the ocean's surface. This starfish and the next three pictures were taken by our guide, Washington, who had the advantage of a weight belt, the ability to dive deeply and stay underwater about 2 minutes, and perhaps most importantly, was not afraid of sharks. let's investigate where land and sea meet. This first few feet where waves wash over the land is called the littoral or coastal zone. This area is teeming with life. The most noticeable residents are the Sally Lightfoot crabs, wandering along the water's edge and running back and forth with the moving surf. These crabs derive their common name from their quick and nimble motions, and how they sometimes even appear to run across the water. They are notoriously difficult to catch, always seeming to anticipate the would-be captor's moves. From island to island, there are subtle differences in the shell patterns, but in every case, these bright red crabs stand out on the black lava rocks along the island coasts. These creatures have a surprising ability to walk up and down the vertical sides of rocks and to suddenly hop from one rock to another. As we're wandering along the shore, let's do a little birding. There are a variety of shorebirds, and northern visitors are sometimes surprised to find familiar species this far south. If you think you know a bird when it comes up on the screen, just yell it out. Anyone know this one? Any birders in here? A ruddy turnstone, I heard someone say. That's right. Often seen on our winter beaches, it's also a common wintering resident down in the Galapagos. How about this one? Got a long bill.
Wimbrel?
Good, somebody got it.
Yeah.
This shorebird is also often found off the New England coast, but in summer, it's a wimbrel. Notice that long, graceful, down-curved beak. I'll be surprised if anyone knows this one. If you do, you're a well-traveled birder. It looks a little like a willet that we have here, but those yellow legs tell us it's not. It's a wandering tattler, a bird that's common on our west coast, but only a rarity here in New England. How about this one? Someone said a tern. Looks a little like a tern with that bill. It's actually called the brown noddy, and it's occasionally seen at the southern tip of Florida, but mostly it resides farther south. Now, I bet you can guess at least the type of bird here.
Little green heron?
It looks like a green heron. It kind of looks the same, but it doesn't quite look the same. Those bright orange legs are different. At one time, it was thought to be a subspecies of our familiar green heron, but it is now classified as a color morph of the striated heron. In the Galapagos, they call it a lava heron, and it is endemic to the islands, but it's not yet recognized as a separate species by World Birding Associations. What about these guys? Are they even birds? They're penguins, of course. Well, as we can see in this pretty crummy movie, slowed down by about half, they do fly through the water. Yes, they actually are birds. This smaller species of penguin is only about 20 inches tall and is known as the Galapagos penguin. This is the only species of penguin that lives this near the equator, and the only reason they can survive here is because of the cold waters from the Humboldt and Cromwell currents. If global climate change brings too many more of those El Nino events, causing these waters to warm, this little fella may find himself with little or no food supply. Okay, that was a little corny, I know. Probably the most popular resident of the littoral zone are the sea lions. They are everywhere. Oh, and notice the sand? And they're so cute. How can you resist them? Oh, and notice the rocks. Sea lion pups are very gregarious, and while you are not allowed to approach them, that may not keep them from approaching you. Oh, and notice we're on sand again. All the sea lions you've seen in the last 3 slides are Galapagos sea lions, an endemic species. They are comfortable on both sand and rocks. Now notice the longer hair on these 2 creatures. These are fur sea lions, often called fur seals, although they are not a true seal. They have longer hair than the Galapagos sea lions and will never be found on the sand, but only on the rocks, because the rocks help them keep cooler. It's hard to appreciate sea lions without watching them play. These 3 youngsters are having a great time in the surf, but watch as one of them comes out. He's going to demonstrate one clear way to know if you're looking at a sea lion. He walks using all his flippers. Seals cannot use their rear flippers to walk, only the front. Galapagos sea lions mate from May to January, an unusually long mating season. Cows will produce a single pup about a year after mating. For the first 2 to 3 weeks after birth, the mother is constantly nursing and caring for her pup. After this, she has to return to the ocean to replenish her own store of fat. As the pup grows older, these excursions may take 1 or even 2 weeks. Other cows will manage a nursery to watch the pups, whose mothers are hunting, but they won't nurse these pups. If a mother dies while hunting and never returns, her pup will simply starve to death. Although a mother will continue to breed, having a pup about once a year, the older pups maintain a close dependency on their mother until they are 2 or 3 years old. The coastal rocks of the Galapagos Islands are often covered with large groups of iguanas. These will always be the Galapagos marine iguana. While they can attain a length of 5 feet, mostly they're 2 to 3 feet. They are a species found nowhere else in the world. No other iguana has the ability to swim underwater and get its food entirely from seaweed and algae. Marine iguanas have evolved salt glands, which spray out the excess salt they ingest. These glands are between their nose and eyes, so the spray collects and dries on their face, often turning it white, as we see here. Charles Darwin described these iguanas as hideous looking and most disgusting, clumsy lizards. I'm devastated. How could he say that about me? Oh, there, honey. You don't look all that bad to me. These iguanas come primarily in shades of black and gray. The dark colors help them warm quickly when they emerge from the water. Although this single species has spread to all the islands, on each island it has evolved slightly different colorations. For example, only on Espanola Island are the breeding males brightly colored shades of red and green. As we move from the marine iguanas to the land iguanas, I want you to look carefully at that distinctive spiny crest down the back of the marine iguana. As we move inland away from the shore, we find the Galapagos land iguana. Notice that crest is much less pronounced than in the marine iguana. This species is also endemic and can be as large as 3 to 5 feet in length. They are primarily vegetarian, getting about 90% of their food from the widespread prickly pear cacti on the islands. They will eat all parts of the cactus, including the thorns. The biggest threat to these slow-moving lizards are introduced feral animals, such as pigs, rats, cats, and dogs. In contrast to the huge land iguanas, these little guys are only about 6 to 12 inches. This is a Galapagos lava lizard, the most abundant reptile in the islands. There are 7 species of these lizards, which are thought to have evolved from a common ancestor. Each island has only one species, although one particular species is found on several different islands. Lava lizards are omnivores, eating plants, insects, and even each other on occasion. The females have red on their throats, which may extend onto the face, as with this lady. But other than that red throat, they vary a great deal in color, often blending in quite well with their surroundings. Now, let's take a moment to look at the vegetation on the islands. By starting with the younger islands in the northwest and working towards the older islands in the southeast, we can follow the process by which plant life gradually transforms their surface. On the younger, more barren volcanic islands, seeds of a hardy plant may eventually take root, the way this one did next to a lava tube. Plants like this gray mat plant take hold in the sandy soil created by erosion of the volcanic rock. This erosion is accomplished by wind, water, and other plants, like the lava cactus, which finds a root hold on what seems to be almost bare volcanic rock. Over millions of years, those plants repeatedly grow and die, gradually creating a layer of soil which becomes thick enough to allow for the growth of more complex plants, like this beautiful muyoyu flower on the much older Santa Fe Island. Here, at the center of Santa Cruz, the frequent rainfall at high elevation also promotes plant growth, resulting in a very dense forest on the slopes of the ancient volcano. The most common plant in the Galapagos Islands is the opuntia, or prickly pear cactus. There are 6 species and 14 varieties spread out among the islands. They range in size from a low 4-foot scrub plant, like this one, to tall tree-like plants with brown trunks, like this 20-foot tall one on Bartolome Island. Some species can grow up to 40 feet tall, with trunks over 3 feet in diameter. These cacti play an important role in the food chain on the Galapagos Islands. They form primary diet of iguanas and tortoises, as well as providing food and shelter for doves, mockingbirds, and, as we see here, finches. All parts of a prickly pear, the flower, the pear, the pad, the stem, and even the spines are eaten or used by various animal species. In fact, our next resident depends a great deal on these plants. No, I don't mean this guy. First, we have a short history lesson. In 1535, Father Tomas de Berlanga, the Bishop of Panama, chanced on these islands when his vessel went off course during a trip to Peru. While there is evidence of indigenous South American visitors prior to this, it was the first recorded visit, and in 1570, the islands appeared on European maps as Insulae de los Galapagos, meaning islands of the tortoises in Spanish. Thus it is that these amazing giant creatures gave their name to these islands. This picture gives you some idea of their enormous size. Here is the Galapagos giant tortoise in the wild. It is found only in these islands, and it is the largest tortoise in the world. Reaching a length of as much as 6 feet and a weight of 900 pounds, it can live for over 100 years. One specimen, collected by Darwin in 1835, died recently in 2006 at an estimated age of 175. It was the tortoise that first gave Darwin a critical clue. He wrote in his diary from the Beagle, quote, "I have not as yet noted by far the most remarkable feature in the natural history of this archipelago. It is that the different islands to a considerable extent are inhabited by a different set of beings. My attention was first called to this fact by the Vice Governor, Mr. Lawson, declaring that the tortoises differed from the different islands, and that he could with certainty tell from which island any one was brought. Because they were so endangered by human activity, hunting for meat and destruction of its eggs by rats, dogs, cats, and pigs, these tortoises are being kept at the Charles Darwin Center on Santa Cruz Island. Baby tortoises are hatched and raised here at the center, where their survival rate is over 90% compared to about 5% in the wild. Each tiny tortoise is carefully marked, and when they are old enough, they will be returned to the island where their egg was collected and allowed to live in the wild. Now look carefully at these 4 pictures. How can we tell that these are pictures of 4 different tortoises and not just different views of the same tortoise? Anybody? Right, the shape of the shell. Okay, each of them has a differently shaped shell. The 2 extremes are the upper left, where the shell at the front curves right back down to the tortoise's neck, and the one on the lower right, which has a saddleback shell that curves upwards very high over the tortoise's extended neck. Long after he had returned to England, Darwin realized that these creatures had naturally selected for a shell shape which met their food and mating needs. On islands with plenty of low vegetation and short cacti, the more common dome shape on the left works fine. But on islands where the cacti are tall and the tortoises needed to reach up to be able to feed, those who were born with shells more like the saddle shape and with longer necks that gave them the ability to reach higher had the advantage. They thrived and lived to mate and pass that genetic variation onto their offspring. Speaking of genetic variation, let's look at the other island resident, which helped Darwin understand the concept of natural selection. This series of not very exciting pictures shows 5 small plain birds from 3 different islands. They are not very colorful or photogenic and would be easy to overlook. In fact, although Darwin collected birds like these on his 1835 trip, he did not pay them much attention, thinking them to be finches, grosbeaks, and blackbirds. But when he returned to London, John Gould, a well-known ornithologist, declared them to be all related new species of finches. Eventually, they came to be known collectively as Darwin's finches. After hearing what Gould had to say, he examined his specimens of these plain little birds much more carefully. In 1845, Darwin published a second edition of his Journal and Remarks on the Beagle's Voyage, in which he added the following comment to the earlier 1839 edition. Quote, "Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends." This was a significant step on his path to accepting natural selection as the mechanical means by which evolution of species might occur. These very different birds had developed in part to have beaks related to the kinds of food they ate. Compare the beak of the large ground finch here to that of the warbler finch here, or the cactus finch here. Darwin finally realized that, as with the tortoises, the different foods available on the different islands resulted in this amazing variety of species from a single ancestor. Okay, enough about finches. Let's look at some of the other birds found here. In general, there are not a lot of different kinds of birds on the Galapagos, and many of them, like the finches, are not very colorful. These rather plain mockingbirds represent 2 of the 4 species on the islands. The hood mockingbird in the last slide, and the Galapagos mockingbird in this one. The Galapagos flycatcher has a little more color, but not very much. The familiar yellow warbler is one of the brighter birds on the islands. However, arguably, the most colorful small land bird on the islands is the Galapagos dove. Its bright blue eye, red feet, and rufous color certainly make it stand out from the green background. In the high country, near the center of Santa Cruz Island, we encountered the Galapagos white-cheeked pintail, a very beautiful duck. Returning to the coast, we encounter 2 ubiquitous residents. First is the brown pelican, a very large and elegant looking bird. Next is one of the 2 species of endemic gulls in the Galapagos Islands, the swallow-tailed gull. It is the only known species of night-feeding gull in the world. This is not a lava gull, the other and much rarer species which we never saw. But we did see plenty of these beautiful birds with their chicks. Because they are nocturnal feeders, their eyes are very large and sensitive to light. I was unable to find any function for that bright red eye ring, but it certainly makes for dramatic photographs. Along the cliffs of South Plaza Island, red-billed tropic birds both nest and soar. We saw them there, and I was able to photograph this one on the nest. But that's all I got. So I'm supplementing these pictures with more recent ones from Tobago, so you can see what a beautiful bird this is in flight. As our boat traveled from one island to another, we were constantly accompanied by a fascinating little bird with a white rump band. As it flew, its legs would dangle in the air while it hovered over the blue sea. It would descend to the surface, but never land, appearing to dance on the water. These were white-vented storm petrels, and often they formed sizable groups, dancing with the sunlight on the warm ocean waves. Without a doubt, the most well-known, most photographed bird in the Galapagos Islands is, all together now,
Booby.
the blue-footed booby. So, how does this bird get its name? No, not the blue-footed part, but the booby part. The answer is that these are seabirds who are graceful on the fly and even dive and swim underwater to catch fish. However, on land, they're kind of slow and clumsy, so the early Spanish named them bobo, meaning stupid. You have to admit that in the picture on the right, he does look a few French fries short of a Happy Meal. So, is this a green-footed booby? Nope. This is a Nazca booby, and this one is drying his wings. These birds are very social, and as we will see in the next film clip, they enjoy preening each other. Here we see a mother preening herself while keeping her chick warm. Wherever we traveled on our boat, we were accompanied by a graceful flock of frigate birds. These wonderful birds simply glide and soar effortlessly around the boat. There are two kinds of frigate birds in the Galapagos, the magnificent and the great. It's difficult for even an experienced birder to tell the difference between the two. But the great frigate birds are usually much farther out to sea, while the ones that follow the boats are almost always the magnificent frigate birds. How could one ever tire of watching this perfection of flight? Often, the birds would perch on the boat, like this fellow. These breeding males have a red sac called a guller sac. This sac can actually be inflated much larger than we see here. In fact, it can get all the way up to a point that would make us think it will be just a teeny tiny bit uncomfortable. However, the discomfort is apparently bearable when there's a female nearby you need to impress. Oh, come on, just pay me a little attention. I'm so handsome. I just have this one place on my back to scratch. Ooh, watch out for that stick. These guller sacs can take up to half an hour to completely fill with air. So that's why you sometimes see the birds flying around with them still fully or partially inflated. This brackish lagoon on Floriana Island is home to what many consider to be the most dramatic bird in the islands, the greater flamingo. I mean, really. Have you ever seen anything like that beak or that color? What a spectacular bird. And when a pair of them comes flying in, flashing those pink and black wings, well, I have to say, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Now, look at that beak one more time. Do you remember what beak shape is related to? You've been paying attention? To food, that's right, what you eat. The flamingo uses its long neck and that very unusual beak to filter lots of water and capture very tiny brine shrimp and other crustaceans. It's these which are responsible for its pink color. Notice how this bird is using its feet to dig into the mud and agitate it, so there will be more organisms for it to filter as it swings its beak back and forth. And of course, everyone has to scratch an itch now and then. They also use their long necks and beaks to preen and wash. Actually, this may be a good time to answer the question people often ask about this bird: why does it stand on just one leg? The answer, of course, is that if it didn't, it would fall over. I think this bathing flamingo was one of the most captivating things I photographed during our entire trip. So, is this the end? Certainly not for the Galapagos Islands. The little bit we've seen today is just the briefest of snapshots in geologic time. Like any one of these photographs, it is a frozen instant of one of the countless possible instants that might have been captured. Do you recall that at the beginning of this program we posed a question? What was it about these islands that provided Darwin with the clues which led to his historic breakthrough in our understanding of evolution? I think as we have wandered through the islands, looking at the different life forms we find here, we have discovered a possible answer. These islands at the edge of the world don't have the complexity of life that is found on the continents. On the mainland, the web of life is so intricate that it is very difficult to tease out the relationships between organisms. Because these islands are isolated both from each other and from the rest of the world, they have relatively few species living in a confined and observable space. So when Darwin came and started collecting and recording, he was presented with pretty easily identified situations in which natural selection had occurred. Of course, he didn't recognize this until after he had returned home, consulted with others, and had the time to reflect on what he had seen. But ultimately, he was able to make the connections that led him to recognize how species might evolve. Evolution, by the process of natural selection, is both an amazingly simple idea and an enormously complex process to trace. As humans, we try very hard to keep nature as we find it. We think of the world we grew up in as the right world, but nature, using the power of time and numbers, is always changing and adapting. The world we see is the result of one set of changes, but nature was ready to go in many different directions. That is its power. had different food sources arrived due to different currents or different weather conditions or different geologic events have occurred, then these animals might have selected different variations which favored those circumstances. Just as we look around us and see each of our friends as both similar and different, so all living things are born with countless variations and in enormous numbers over time. It is these variations which allow nature to adapt and evolve creatures into new species, better ready to deal with the environment in which they find themselves. I hope these pictures and this narrative will encourage you to consider making your own journey to these islands at the edge of the earth and to consider the powerful story that they have to tell. We're not quite finished. Before I open it up to questions, I'd like to clarify something. People often think these islands, because they are so remote, are completely deserted. And this show certainly might have added to that sense. However, that's not exactly true. While my show deals with natural life in the Galapagos, there is also a human side to these islands. Statistics are hard to come by, but as best as I can determine, about 30,000 people live here. More than 20,000 of those live on Santa Cruz, with the bulk in the port town of Puerto Ayora. The next most populated island is San Cristobal, with the bulk of the people living there residing in the provincial capital of Puerto Baquez Moreno. On Isabela, there's also a small but significant population in the town of Puerto Villamil, which has a research center. Two other islands, Floriana and Baltra, have a few folks scattered around as well. However, thanks to a great deal of hard work, most of the islands are now not inhabited, and the government of Ecuador works hard to minimize the impact of tourists on the wildlife of these islands. The number of people on an island at any one time is very closely monitored, and when you visit, you cannot wander but must walk on carefully laid out trails. While tourism has the potential to harm the wildlife there, it is in fact the source of the funds which are used to preserve and protect the islands. So if it can continue to be allowed but closely monitored, it may be a good thing. And now that's really the end. Okay, so are there questions anyone has about anything?
Can you fly there?
Yes, that's how we got there. The trip we were on, which was a Rhodes Scholar program, started in Quito, which is the capital of Ecuador and is at 10,000 feet in the mountains. And we spent 3 days there. Then we drove over the 14,000 foot mountains down into the Amazon Valley and stayed on the river down there for 3 days. Then drove back to Quito one more night and then flew directly to the Galapagos, spent 7 days on a boat going around, and then flew to Guayaquil, which is a coastal city of Ecuador, and spent our last night there. Yes?
You mentioned a research center?
Yes, there's a research center on Santa Cruz Island, which is the most populated island.
What kind of things are they researching?
Primarily the tortoises. It's the Charles Darwin Center, but their work is primarily concerned with the tortoises, although they have banding stations for birds there as well. So it's a general scientific research center, but the tortoises are definitely what they focus on there. Yes.
That one tortoise that died 185 years after birth, was it? In
175 years later,
In
they
Australia?
estimate he was 175 years old.
Was it an Australian zoo, any chance?
I believe it was in England. I
It was
think,
not Galapagos then.
yeah, I think it was in England, but I couldn't say that for sure, because I just know I read that it was one that Darwin had collected, so it may be that it ended up in an Australian zoo, so,
England zoo.
yeah. Yes.
Was this a special tour that you were on with Rhodes Scholars, or was it a tour that would be available to anyone?
It's a regular tour that's available to anyone.
Okay, now the reason I'm asking is you evidently had a lot of time to patiently take photographs. And when you're on a tour or a boat where you're moving and moving and moving, how did they allow for you to have your own individual time like that?
Well, when you were on the boat, there's 16 people on the boat. In fact, one of the rules in the Galapagos Islands is that there have to be no more than 16 people for every guide. The guide has to be a native-born Galapagos resident, and that's why all the boats go in multiples of 16. That is, a boat will either have 16 people or 32 people. The National Geographic boat goes with 96 people. And you always go with one guide for every 16 people. As far as taking the pictures, I do a lot of travel photography, and you just kind of get used to catching pictures on the fly. I had one camera that I used for all my still shots, and a video camera. And then when we went snorkeling, I had an underwater camera that was not an expensive one particularly. I try as much as I can now as I get older to travel with just one camera and one lens for everything.
Did you feel you had enough time or were you frustrated having to keep moving and leaving?
Well, it's always a little frustrating when you're with a tour and you have to keep on moving along, but you get used to that.
Okay.
What time of year did you go?
We were there in February, second half of February, and the water was pretty warm when we were there. If you come later in the summer, the trips are a little less expensive and you'll probably get a little colder water for your snorkeling, but you wear a wetsuit anyway all the time to protect you from jellyfish when you're snorkeling. And we snorkeled, I think, virtually every day, probably twice, and then visited 2 places on the islands as well each day. So kept you pretty busy while you were there. Other questions? Yes?
How many islands are there?
Well, what did I say at the beginning? There's like about 8 or 9 main islands, I think. But then there's thousands and thousands of little tiny islands all over the place. We visited, I think, about 6 or 7 islands, a couple of them being not big islands, but just small islands. Every boat goes to a different set of islands, and that boat always goes to those islands. So the tour you take will determine which islands you go to see. Some people will go back and take a second tour, but you'll never get a boat that goes to all the islands. And there are a few islands, particularly way up to the north, that are only visited by scientists or very special tours if you're on a research tour or something. Yes?
Being so close to the equator, there should be not much of a change in climate unless the currents come in at different times.
Yeah, it's the currents, as we were saying,
How
that
about the
determines the
food
climate.
Sea lions, the anchoveta, that comes in the Hamburg,
I'm sorry?
the anchoveta, the fish, the little sardines, the main food
Yeah,
of the sea lions.
yeah.
It comes with what? What current? The Hamburg?
I think that's from both the Humboldt and the Cromwell currents. Both of those are cold water currents. The Cromwell comes in from the west, and the Humboldt comes up from Antarctica.
Oh, okay.
Okay? But then when those two get blocked, then the amount of food drastically reduces.
Yeah. I think at one point Peru was the largest fishing nation on the world, because of the anchovy ban. Except they didn't eat them in Peru, they processed them for meal, chicken food,
Yeah.
till it died off or didn't.
For those of you that can't hear what he was saying, he's saying that the small fish which the sea lions eat, at one time Peru was, you were saying, the largest,
Yes, 8 million tons in
8 million
60s.
tons a year
Yeah.
that they would harvest, but probably they are getting overfished like any other fish.
No.
No?
They disappeared. Period.
Yeah, I think it's El Nino.
Yeah,
The El Nino that's keeping them. Okay, other questions?
Because they're so sensitive to preserving the environmental quality for scientific reasons and tourism, they must have a fairly strongly developed sustainability sense in the human population there. Is that correct? Do they have, do you know any measures they take to, like turn the water supply or use recycled materials and that sort of thing?
I would say the general population of the Galapagos is probably more kept in line of what they ought to be doing by the Ecuadorian government. But it was the population of the islands originally, who were farmers that came there, that brought everything in that pretty well decimated the islands when they first started. And they were not fond of being told, you're going to have to move just into these areas and we're going to put some very strict rules about how things can be moved. Even when we were there, some of the boat captains would like to kind of try and, well, I'll take you guys around to this place where we really shouldn't be. Well, now I understand they are putting GPS monitors on every single boat, so they know right where all the boats are and to make sure they're going exactly where they should be. So I didn't get a huge sense that they were super environmentally sensitive or concerned there, more so than, sort of average people.
Are they controlling the feral population?
The government of Ecuador comes in with helicopters and will actually do big drives to herd the goats all into one area and then shoot them, which is kind of, you hate to see that, but by the same token, if you don't, those are the animals, wild goats and pigs that just decimate the native population.
What do they do with the rats?
I don't know. I don't know about how they control the rats. As I said at the beginning, I'm not an expert on the Galapagos. So. Yeah.
Some of the creatures you said were endemic to individual islands. Well, are there birds or like tortoise or sea animals? Don't they just go? Don't they just fly or swim?
You would think they could. For example, one of the birds we didn't see, I would have liked to, but it wasn't on one of the islands we were visiting. There's a flightless cormorant, and it's only on one island, and it's just developed there. It can swim, and the islands aren't that far apart, but it had no natural predators, so it had no need to fly, and gradually it just evolved into the only flightless cormorant in the world. But yeah, that was a question I asked when they were, why can't they just sort of, it's not that far apart, can't they go? And they don't seem to. By the way, if you're interested in pursuing the idea of evolution on the Galapagos a little bit, there's a fascinating book that was written, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s called The Beak of the Finch. And it's pretty interesting for a scientific book. It actually is almost hard to put down once you get started. And it talks about a research study they did starting in the 80s for following some populations of finches to see just how evolution would take place. And when they started this, they were fully expecting to spend 15 or 20 years or more hoping to see some small changes. And they were completely shocked to discover that they saw major changes in beak size in direct response to food availability in 1 year. in one year. It blew them away. They had no idea it could possibly go that fast. So it's a very interesting book if you get a chance to read it, called The Beak of the Finch. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. If you're interested just in looking at more of my photographs, we have a church fair coming up in a couple of weeks, and so I'm in the process of getting cards ready to sell. It's the only time I ever sell, and I'm not in the business really of selling my photographs. But I've just brought these along because they also give you an idea of some of the other photography that I do. So if you're interested, you're welcome to just take a look. I'm not really prepared to sell anything unless somebody has $20, and I have only 2 sets of cards here. But come to the old St. Andrew's Fair in Bloomfield in a couple of weeks, I think the weekend of the 7th and 8th, and I'll be there along with a lot of other good Christmas things and lots of good cookies.
Chris, we wanted to thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation, and the photography was incredible, and really worthwhile listening to it and hearing all about it. And I think the students that we have here really enjoyed it as well. And it's great to see you here too. As a little token of appreciation, we'd like to have you have one of our Hartland Land Trust decals with our logo on it.
Thank you very much.
It works great on notepads
I
or
will use that.
notebooks. Not so good in the outdoors.
I was commenting before, does anybody know who designed the logo?
Yes, Eva
It's a
Eva Weymouth.
wonderful logo.
She's out of West Hartland.
Beautiful.
And she really helped us along with that.
Yeah,
Thank you very
beautiful
much.
logo, very nice.
Thanks again, and there are refreshments out here. Also, for our June forum, we're planning on having Jerry Griswold come back and not speak on bats, but possibly porcupines. So keep that in your calendar and think about it.
What's the date?
First Friday in June. Okay, and we'll advertise that as well.
That's a long
We're
way to
taking sponsorships if anybody would like to help out with any of the costs involved in it, and you can contact either myself or anybody else from the Land Trust. Please, there are memberships out here, membership forms, help yourself, and take along a butternut squash with you, please. They're excellent.
If you're not a member of your local land trust, you really should join it. It's a good way to feel that you're doing something even if you don't have time to get out and actually
That's
work
true.
with them. Still
And
a
we'll
good way
keep
to
all the species
help
that are
support
here.
the people who are
here.
doing the good work.
Thanks again.